Right, it's Chris over at Dixieland Farm, and I've recorded this several times. It's hard to get this all out, this story. The story of recorded sound in relation to why there might be a lot of mono in one genre and maybe more in stereo in a different, and the conversion between the two before we all ended up just having stereo records. So back in the original format, when the 78s were king, it was a mono sound. Sound only came out of one speaker. It was a mechanical affair, like it was actually no electronics involved. You had a hand crank, and it would move a diaphragm into a cone, and eventually electronics started getting involved with record players and electric sets. And then the problem with 78s were that the fidelity was not nearly as good, and the records were fragile. So around the late 40s, I think it was 1948, the LP format started coming out in competition with RCA's 45. Now the 45 was basically the same thing as the 78, but much smaller and not breakable. 78s were very easily broken, and the 45 wasn't. They had that mindset that it had to be the same kind of thing. But the benefit of an LP going at 33 and a third, and a larger disc, was you could fit more music on it. Both had great fidelity. So, here's a demo on high fidelity. This isn't stereo. This is actually a mono box here that demonstrates on the qualities of sound. Originally, they didn't even know what to do, so you often see terrible artwork on these early. And again, classical was the big push because you could fit the most music on there. So now they start figuring out what to do with the artwork. And yeah, so a lot of classical, mono, and now stereo in the late 50s gets figured out how to put two channels on one disc, and they figured that out. And again, people with money who want to hear that. So again, a lot of classical in stereo, and a lot of middle of the road, safe music, lounge music, because remember, the people that could afford this equipment were middle-aged probably by that time. So you'll see lots of information on these things, to prove to yourself that it was a good reason to switch over from those terrible mono recordings. You'll see details about microphones, and you get a lot of crazy stereo also, because you wanted to demonstrate this piece of equipment to your friends on why did you just replaced your 78s with LPs a few years ago, and now you're buying more stuff. So Escoval, he actually usually had two bands going in two different studios to get a full stereo effect. And even the LPs, I mean, they're pushing equipment and upgrades and things like that. So on here, again, large detail about the equipment and the frequencies. True stereo, really letting people know this is the real deal and you're going to hear it. Another reason why the music was exaggerated so much is that a lot of those stereos that were sold were console units, so they were like a piece of furniture. The speakers were very close together, even though they were stereo on the left and the right. So there's a lot of ping-ponging to kind of let people know, hey, I got a real stereo here. It's really in stereo. And also, since the speakers weren't that far away, it didn't sound that weird. Ted Heath in high stereo. Full frequency, so you see a lot of that kind of jargon. Even on the mono stuff, va-va-boom, you'll see lots of copy about the equipment, boasting transistorized mixing board. Nobody knows what that is who's probably listening to this music. I know what that means, and you know what that means, but whatever. Stereo, the sound your eyes can follow, really going into that there's going to be motion and movement, and it's well worth the extra $1 your stereo record cost. So those records cost an extra $1. So same thing. And use a from Command Records has that ping pong stereo and really exploits the stereo sound. Again, so middle of the road, classical, exaggerated stereo because the equipment wasn't set up like our setups are. So this one's boasting that it was recorded on 4-track tape, so that's a definite advance from what they used to have, which was just pure 2-track tape, or for a while there was 3-track tape. At the time, so we got classical and we got this easy listening or exotica or all that kind of stuff using stereo. Jazz was recorded very simply. Some people started recording in stereo, and to do 2 different mixes took a bit of energy and time. So people like Rudy Van Gelder basically recorded in stereo, and then they would fold the signal down. If there is nothing in the middle, but everything's on left and right, and when you fold it down, the mix sounds basically the same, but just in mono. It's when things are mixed in between the speakers, that's when mixes change, when you fold down everything into mono. So those kind of mixes would need a dedicated mono mix. So jazz was never a big seller. It, except for a few titles, it never was a huge thing. So a lot of your jazz records are kind of like that. They also recorded basically live, so they're all in the room together. There's a lot of leakage between microphones. So when you listen to jazz records from that period, it doesn't sound nearly as weird as we're going to get into with pop music. Here's another one. Showing off the 20-channel mixer going to a 4-track and then mixed down to a 2-track. Ho ho ho. So with pop music, the kids did not have this equipment. They had small portable players, cheap players. They listened to a lot of music on AM radio. FM radio is not a thing yet. So there was no need to go through all that trouble and expense for a stereo record. So a lot of your early music was in mono. If it was recorded on a 4-track, they used that space not to make a stereo picture, but to record different parts of the song so they'd have a little more control over the mixing. Or more importantly, maybe your pop band wasn't that great. So you had a couple of different chances to get part of the song right and the other part of the song right, and together it sounded good. When you try to mix that 4-track into stereo, your options are very limited. So with the early Beatles, you hear stuff panned. So the kids aren't listening to the stereo anyway. A lot of that music did not have that in mind. So that's why your mid-60s stuff sometimes does not sound great in stereo. It just wasn't the market. It wasn't what they were going for. If they were going to mix to stereo, it was an afterthought to cash in for the people who did have an extra dollar. Remember, stereo records were $1 more. So even as late as Sgt. Pepper, the music was really thought of as a mono thing. That's 67. Rubber Soul, when they mixed it, same thing. They wanted to make sure that it folded down to a normal sounding thing on the radio or on a console. So you get that really wide, weird separation. That's why things sound like that, instead of a natural stereo picture. Those kids start growing up. They start getting part-time jobs after school. Their parents start giving up stereo equipment to get newer stereo equipment. Stereo starts becoming a thing. Right around 65, 66, 67. So some things are in stereo. Some things were recorded in mono, but you want people to buy them in stereo, or people are demanding, hey, why isn't that in stereo? So you get a lot of fake stereo. Duophonic is fake stereo. They do tricks to make it sound like it's in stereo. The tricks do not work very well, and this stuff does not fold down into mono very well on AM radio. So you will see stereo and mono mixes, and the stereo mixes, if they are fake stereo, often are not good. Sometimes they just added echo, sometimes they did some highs are on one speaker, lows are on the other speaker, sometimes they did weird phase and combing tricks that all sound kind of weird. So some of this is like, if you grew up with it, it sounds like you remember it. So electronically reprocessed stereo. So that's not real stereo, wasn't recorded in stereo, they never thought about stereo, and there you go. So, now it's 67, 68, the kids are taking drugs, the kids have real stereos, they're demanding stereos, and artists are now, we're going to end on this, they start using stereo to their advantage. Still recorded between 4 and 8 tracks at this point, but they've got stereo in mind, and it's psychedelic, and music is whizzing around, especially if you listen on headphones. So during that period, you get a lot of still that weird ping-ponging, trippy, freak-out kind of music. That is because that is what the audience wanted. They wanted to trip out to music. They didn't want it to sound like reality. So Cream and all of the different psych bands. The music is now lending itself to stereo. Eventually mono gets phased out. Everyone's got a stereo. FM stereo radio is now a thing. There's no need to go through the extra expense of making a mono. Except for singles. Singles were done in mono for a very long period afterwards, or sometimes you'd find a single with stereo on one side, mono on the other, so it can be played on AM radio without any weird mixing, compatibility, sound differences. So when you're buying records, which one should you buy, the stereo or the mono? Well, it depends. This is still neat in stereo. The mono is probably better. The nice thing is that monos are a little easier to play if they're in worse condition. The reason is that if you have a mono switch, you can convert the mono record. Since you're using a stereo pickup, you're picking up noise on both channels. When you hit the mono switch, the noise that is not common between them tends to go down. So they're a little easier. They're more common, even though they cost for a long time. The mono records were, nobody wanted them, and then everyone wanted them, and now it's back to, well, whatever happens, happens. So that's just a market thing. Record prices go up and down, and things that were hard to get aren't. And anyway, hopefully that is the history of stereo and mono, and why things are the way they are, and why mixes are different and weird, and what to seek out. And man, a lot of information to digest in 13 minutes. Hopefully I didn't go over it too quickly. If I did, you want to talk about it, go ahead and hit me up in the comments. Otherwise, take care everybody, and thanks for watching.